Hello and welcome back to day 2 of Stockholm+49. We had a fantastic start of the conference yesterday. A big thanks to all of our speakers and participants. We have a great lineup planned for today, which will be underway in just a few minutes. But first, I would like to stress the importance of this conference. Let's face it, humankind's influence is causing rapid, widespread changes on our planet. We face a multitude of environmental challenges such as widespread biodiversity loss, the overexploitation of resources, and changes in the climate are being observed in every region of the world. In the last year alone, we have witnessed severe drought, record heat waves, flood, and devastating wildfires. The UN Secretary General called the latest IPCC report a code red for humanity. The historic 1972 Stockholm Conference was the first of its kind to prioritize environmental issues. It represented a major turning point in the development of international environmental politics. Now, as we face the greatest challenge to humanity, climate change, it's time for another turning point. As you know, the summit aims to start the countdown for civil society to contribute to a promising 2022 declaration, which needs to be as ambitious as possible if we are to save our environment and ultimately ourselves. Today, we are joined by world-renowned scientists, economists, lawyers, youth activists, and diplomats who will be discussing the possible legal and governance solutions to the environmental crises that we face. We need all hands on deck if we're going to effectively tackle climate change. So please join us in this discussion and help shape our next turning point. All right. To kick off day 2, we have Dr. David Boyd. David serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and he's also an Associate Professor of Law, Policy, and Sustainability at the University of British Columbia. He is also a prolific writer, authoring 10 books and hundreds of articles on environmental law and policy, human rights, and constitutional law. Welcome, David.
Sorry about the technical glitch there. Thanks for that introduction, Kimberly. And just wanted to say I do live on the west coast of Canada, and very much like you said in your introduction, Kimberly, here on the west coast, we experienced an unprecedented heat wave this summer with temperatures reaching 50 degrees. This caused hundreds of deaths. The town of Lytton burned to the ground in a matter of minutes. Wildfires generated massive amounts of air pollution. And to illustrate the direct connection between the climate and biodiversity crisis, scientists estimate that the heat wave killed 1 billion marine animals. As you said, the latest reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPBES, the World Health Organization, and UN Environment confirm that we're living in a multifaceted environmental emergency. The climate crisis, the collapse of biodiversity, pervasive pollution, and the surge in these emerging infectious diseases of zoonotic origin. I want to say that this global environmental crisis is also a human rights crisis. Among the human rights that are being threatened and violated are the rights to life, health, food, water, an adequate standard of living, culture, and of course, the right to a healthy environment. For decades, governments have signed treaties and made pledges to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss, notably in 1992 with the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Convention on Biodiversity. But if we look back, it's a really embarrassing litany of bold rhetoric, timid action, and broken promises. Since 1992, greenhouse gas emissions have risen more than 60%. We're nowhere near meeting the Paris Agreement pledge to hold the increase in global average temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And none of the nature-saving targets agreed upon by parties to the Biodiversity Convention in 2000 or 2010 have been met. And in part, this is because of the Achilles heel of international environmental law, which is the complete absence of compliance and enforcement mechanisms. States can make these bold commitments, fail to meet them, and they're never held accountable. And that's why there's such a vital and promising role for human rights. If we look back at recent centuries, we can see that human rights have been a catalyst for societal transformations, including the abolition of slavery, progress towards equality for women, and the end of apartheid. Rights are currently being used by Indigenous peoples, LGBTQ plus individuals, and persons with disabilities. It's never easy or simple, but there can be no doubt that human rights have sparked positive and transformative changes. And human rights can definitely help overcome the weakness of international environmental law. For example, in 2019, the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, in the Urgenda case, ruled that the Dutch government violated its citizens' right to life under the European Convention on Human Rights by failing to take sufficiently ambitious action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The court ordered the government to make faster and deeper emissions cuts, and the government responded by closing a coal-fired power plant, investing billions in renewables, putting solar panels on the roofs of schools, lowering speed limits, and more. Similarly, a few months ago, the Constitutional Court of Germany ordered the government to adopt more ambitious targets and accelerate the pace of climate action. And within weeks, Germany had agreed to cut emissions 65% by 2030 and speed up their target for getting to net zero emissions. In Australia, a judge warned the government about the devastating impacts of further coal expansion on the rights of children, essentially telling the government not to approve any new coal mines. These decisions illustrate that environmental law plus human rights law equals accountability. And in the face of the climate crisis, climate litigation based on human rights is exploding all over the world, in France, Switzerland, India, Pakistan, Canada, the United States, Colombia, Brazil, South Africa, and more. Even more powerful, though, in the context of the planetary environmental emergency in which we're living, is the emergence of a new human right, the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Internationally, this right was first mentioned in the Stockholm Declaration in 1972. Portugal and Spain were the first countries to put this right in their constitutions in 1976 and 1978. And today, the right to a healthy environment is recognized in law by more than 80% of the UN's member states through constitutions, legislation, court decisions, and regional treaties. What is the right to a healthy environment? Well, it's a bundle of procedural and substantive rights. On the substantive side, it includes clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, a safe climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and non-toxic environments where people can live, work, study, and play. The procedural side includes access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice with effective remedies. The interpretation of the right to a healthy environment has to be guided by key principles, including non-discrimination, non-regression, prevention, and precaution. Does it really make a difference? The answer is unequivocally yes. Research demonstrates that recognition of the right to a healthy environment is a catalyst for stronger environmental laws and policies, improved implementation and enforcement of those laws and policies, higher levels of public participation in environmental decision-making, and most importantly, improved environmental outcomes on the ground. So countries that recognize this right have reduced air pollution more quickly, have reduced greenhouse gas emissions more quickly, and have extended safe drinking water to a higher proportion of their citizens. Some good news, my friends, that on October 8th, 2021, less than 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution recognizing for the first time at the global level that everyone, everywhere, has the right to live in a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, a right which clearly includes a safe climate. The right to a healthy environment is really the ultimate fusion of international human rights law and international environmental law. And the resolution itself actually states the following: the Human Rights Council affirms that the promotion of the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment requires the full implementation of the multilateral environmental agreements under the principles of international environmental law. Although this resolution from the United Nations is not legally binding, it will be a catalyst for more ambitious action at the national level. And we can look back at the 2010 UN resolution on the rights to water and sanitation to see what kind of impacts these resolutions have. A number of countries, including Costa Rica, Fiji, Mexico, Slovenia, and Tunisia, added the right to water to their constitutions, their strongest and highest laws. A number of other countries, from Colombia to France, added this right to legislation. And most importantly, nations accelerated their efforts to fulfill the right to water. So Mexico has extended safe drinking water to more than 1,000 rural communities in the last decade. Slovenia has prioritized safe drinking water for Roma communities living in informal settlements. And in Canada, over the past 6 years, our federal government has partnered with Indigenous people to deliver safe drinking water infrastructure to more than 115 communities that had gone without safe drinking water, in some cases for decades. The bottom line is this: the right to a healthy environment should be one of the central elements of the Stockholm+50 Declaration. Human rights must be at the heart of all climate, conservation, and anti-pollution action to maximize both progress and equity. And this should be increasingly recognized as an obligation, not an option. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It is absolutely essential to have human rights at the heart of any declaration or agreement addressing the environmental crises we face. Now, our next speaker actually attended the historic 1972 Stockholm Conference. Please join me in welcoming Jan Gustaf Strandenes. Jan Gustaf currently serves as a senior advisor on governance for the Stakeholder Forum for a Sustainable Future. Jan Gustaf has had an illustrious career, beginning with his work at the United Nations on environment and governance in the 1970s. Since then, he has taught about the UN for more than 4 decades, worked with the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, and has delivered a myriad of projects for the UN Environment Program on stakeholder engagement and governance issues, just to name a few. Thank you for joining us today, Jan Gustaf.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, friends of the environment, you know now how old I was, because yes, I was in Stockholm in 1972 as a volunteer and intern for Morris Strong and his team. Let me first thank the organizer for initiating this conference and for inviting me to give a keynote speech. I have been asked to talk on the legacy of the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, which established the UN Environment Program UNEP. Next year, we will commemorate 50 years of work with UNEP and 50 years of fight for the environment. For a fight it has been, and a fight it will be for many years, I think. Morris Strong, the Secretary General of the Stockholm Conference and the first executive director of UNEP, opened the conference in 1972 with the following words: "We have made a global decision of immeasurable importance to which this meeting testifies. We have determined that we must control and harness the forces which we have ourselves created. We know that if these forces can be effectively controlled, they will provide everything that life on this planet desires and requires. But if they are permitted to dominate us, they will have an insatiable and unforgiving appetite. If the forces we have created are permitted to dominate us, they will ultimately consume us." That is the gist of what Morris Strong said. I look around me now and I see too many proofs that what he said is true. The forces have dominated us, and they have decimated biodiversity. They have filled the atmosphere with pollution. They are about to choke us with the chilling effects of global warming. They have laid waste to large tracts of our oceans. They have forced hunger and poverty on millions of people, and have created a world where inequality between large segments of society is increasing in every nation in this world. Inequality dominates and makes a mockery of justice and fairness almost everywhere. Do we need another conference to tell us what we already know? Is all this worth a celebration? Well, let's see. Morris Strong was, of course, not the only person attending this conference back in 1972. There were 250 NGOs accredited. More than 10,000 people attended the 2-week conference. 113 countries had sent their representatives to Stockholm, but only 2 heads of state prioritized the environment enough to attend. It was the Prime Minister of Sweden, Mr. Olof Palme, and the Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Reflecting Cold War politics at the time, the entire Soviet bloc boycotted the conference. Olof Palme gave a nearly 20-minute long intervention during the conference, concluding his statement with the following: "In the field of human environment, there is no individual future, neither for human beings nor for nations. Our future is common. We must share it together. We must shape it together." Share and shape. And did the Stockholm Conference manage to do that? Well, the conference did shape. The delegation agreed on a declaration with 26 principles, 109 paragraph strong action plan, and 5 resolutions, all containing novel policies for the time. What has become mainstay elements of global environmental policies today is found in these documents. The action plan and resolutions covered, in summary, 4 large areas: environmental assessment, natural resource management, conversion of nuclear energy, and the environmental fund. But there was more. What we call today the Stockholm legacy represented a first back in 1972, a legacy that has lasting relevance and on which we can build a better future if we have the courage and political will to do so. The legacy itself covers at least 6 areas. The conference gave us a global institution and home for environmental law, the beginning of environmental governance, an institution to connect science with the environment. And as the Stockholm Conference allowed civil society and NGOs to address the plenary on a regular basis, it created a precedent changing all subsequent UN conferences forever, allowing greater participation from non-state stakeholders in intergovernmental meetings. Environmental diplomacy began at the time, and environmental assessment and management began. 6 areas of huge significance. And why were they a first back then? Well, the Swedish government with the UN had used 4 years of preparing the conference in 1972. The conference's success rested on reports and input from a broad array of experts and scientific institutions in a global effort to generate a comprehensive body of knowledge on the human environment. This resulted in more than 20,000 pages of documentations from experts around the world. And 80 countries participating had provided an environmental assessment of their own natural state of mind and physics. This was also a first. This process and the conference proved to be a watershed event in the influence of science on international environmental policymaking. Scientists throughout centuries have used a metaphor stating that they are standing on the shoulders of giants, which actually express the meaning of discovering truth by building on previous discoveries. In many respects, the Stockholm Conference did also that. The truth the conference discovered was the result of struggles for environment through decades, which had resulted in decisions agreed to before 1972. But most of these struggles were driven by scientists or by engaged persons, very few by politicians. For instance, in 1946, the International Whaling Commission agreed to a convention to safeguard the whales for future generations. In 1948, environmentalists from all walks of life and from around the world founded the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, in IUCN in France. 1950, the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, a UN specialized agency working on atmospheric issues, was founded. 1962, Rachel Carson, a courageous crusader for the environment, published her book Silent Spring, which literally began the people's environmental movement. 1971, UNESCO, another UN specialized agency, founded its science program on the environment named Man and Biosphere. But the Stockholm Conference and the founding of UNEP were the first efforts to coordinate environmental issues and combine them with social, economic, governance, legal, and civic issues. A first to look at the interlinkages and deal with implementation across sectoral issues. The legacy is today in danger of becoming sidelined, with many of the key issues relegated to memorable dinner speeches and idle talks. We should use the Stockholm 50 conference to make a renewed stand for the environment, for good governance and democracy, for justice, rights, equality, and fairness, including working for the future. Mrs. Indira Gandhi spoke about the perils of subjecting issues to mere talk. In her 1972 presentations, she said, "It is clear that the environmental crisis which is confronting the world will profoundly alter the future destiny of our planet. The process of change challenges present international policies. Will the growing awareness of one Earth and one environment guide us to the concept of one humanity?" Her question is still unanswered. People see and experience problems and demand change in issues of deforestation, water shortage, disease, pollution, and of waste. People defend the environment and are murdered for their stance. Throughout history, politicians respond to their demands by saying, change is not possible, it's difficult, it's too costly, it will cause impossible obstacles for the national development. But insistent talk, continued talk, lobby efforts and actions, people win the arguments, and subsequently politicians begin using the language in their decision-making processes. Reading history and the statement is vindicated again and again. Nature had just taught us another dramatic lesson. A reckless, irresponsible, and greedy exploitation of nature for short-term gains are among the egregious reasons behind the zoonotic disease that gave us the corona pandemic. Resetting the world on an environmentally sound basis after the pandemic is proving to be just as difficult as changing our overall actions. The ongoing UN Environment Assembly wanted nature-based solutions as its key theme. It was too radical for a majority of member states, and UNEA had to settle for a compromise. The environment is still time and again reduced to a lower priority by governments. This must change, and we should use this occasion to change that. What David Boyd just said about environmental rights and human rights is hopeful. Maurice Strong was also optimistic when he opened the conference in 1972. He said that our purpose here is to reconcile man's legitimate immediate ambitions with the rights of others, with respect for all life supporting systems, and with the rights of generations yet unborn. We wish to advance not recklessly, not ignorantly, not selfishly and perilously, as we've done in the past, but with greater understanding, wisdom, and vision. That was 50 years ago, and his statement is still relevant today. I asked at the beginning, do we need another conference to tell us what to do? And I would say emphatically, yes, we do. Events like these should be used to define and state demands. We could, based on the Stockholm legacy issues, demand that all governments, for instance, continue to develop environmental rights and human rights for the environment. What David Boyd just said is a very, very good development. And the work on the resolution 73333 is a good beginning. We could upgrade UNEP to a specialized agency with sufficient resources. We could upgrade UNEP's efforts to contribute to a green and just transition to a green economy with green investments. We could strengthen UNEP's research and science base, strengthen and further develop environmental governance, environmental diplomacy, and environmental rights, and human rights coupled with that, and make sure that civil society and non-state stakeholders will always have a say in environmental matters, and make sure their participation is protected and that they can work without being persecuted. Friends, we should compose a strong +50 declaration that can guide us forward with a clear rallying cry. We will fight for the environment. We will fight for justice, equality, rights-based approaches, and fairness, and we will fight for the future generations, no less. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jan Gustav, for your presentation and steadfast work on environmental governance. Our next speaker is an expert on international relations and environmental policy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maria Ivanova. Maria is an author and associate professor of global governance, director of the Global Governance and Human Security PhD program, and director of the Center for Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Maria also serves on the Joint Scientific Committee of the World Climate Research Program, and her recent book, The Untold Story of the World's Leading Environmental Institution, UNEP at 50, was published earlier this year. Maria, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me in this space, for having the opportunity to address this assembly and to share some of my thoughts. Anniversaries is what we're celebrating now, what we are preparing to celebrate. An anniversary of the Stockholm Conference, Stockholm+50 coming up next year, the anniversary of the creation of what I call the anchor institution for the global environment, UNEP, at 50 years created in 1972. So 50 years of these two remarkable events. But why do we celebrate anniversaries? They are opportunities to reflect on the past and to imagine the future. As Jan Gustav just said, bringing the speeches of Maurice Strong, of Indira Gandhi, of Olof Palme, there is no individual future. Our future is common. That's what Olof Palme said in 1972. That's what the current Secretary General is saying today with his powerful, readable, and compelling report, Our Common Agenda. So our common agenda for our common future. What can we do today? Let's reflect on the past and let's imagine the future of the anchor institution for the global environment, of UNEP. So I'll walk you through a bit of UNEP's creation, of its past. Why was it created? How? What is it supposed to do? How has it done it? And let's imagine this future together and see what kind of institution do we need for our common future. If we reflect on the past of UNEP as the world's leading environmental institution, it was created for the very purpose to be the authority on the global environment. In 1972, governments came together and said, we do need an institution that brings the tapestry of the UN system and of the non-governmental system and of the multilateral state system together. And we need an institution to do that. Therefore, we are creating the program on environment of the UN system, the United Nations Environment Program. What was it supposed to do? It was supposed to be the scientific voice on the environment, to monitor the state of the global environment continuously, and to alert us of new and upcoming problems, to tell us what we need to address. It was also supposed to create the policies, to guide action to resolve these problems that were identified by the science. It was also supposed to be the catalyst in the UN system and coordinate action among the various UN agencies, funds, programs, so that they bring their efforts together to resolving global environmental problems. And it was supposed to catalyze action among the member states and support the institutional development in member states on national environmental policies that would implement the global environmental agenda. Do we need those functions today? Absolutely. The original vision, the original mandate of the United Nations Environment Program is even more valid today when we have the crisis, the interconnected crisis, as Inger Andersen, UNEP's director, pointed out yesterday, on climate, biodiversity, and pollution. UNEP is in authority to keep the global environment under review, to suggest policies and develop laws, to mobilize the UN system for global collective action. It has, however, seen challenges, both within the UN system and from member states. It has been a competitor within the UN system. It has been challenged by competition from the other UN actors, and it has been challenged by member states who have not delivered on their commitments and on their commitments to resolve environmental issues and on their commitments to fund the agency so that it can deliver on the mandate that it was given. So UNEP has been both successful and has seen its challenges. It has been successful when two conditions had been met, when it has been both in authority and unauthority, when it has had the legal mandate to deliver certain functions, that is being in authority, and when it has the reputation, the credibility to deliver results, that is when you are unauthority. An institution is effective when it is both in and unauthority. So how do we imagine a future for this anchor institution for the global environment? I would like to say that we need to reimagine multilateralism. We need to reimagine environmental multilateralism. And how do we do that? The multilateral system was created by powerful states for powerful interests. We are thinking about the colonial past that we are facing today. And we have to face the colonial past of the institutions that we're trying to reform. This century is the time to reimagine multilateralism. And this century is the time of small states and small institutions to be nimble, to be flexible, to inspire, and to lead. Environment is the space where this leadership needs to be taken up and provides the opportunity for that leadership to become action. Small states put issues on the agenda, and they do so with interconnectedness in mind. And the environment is anything, if anything, the environment is that space of interconnectedness where all of these issues are, we see how one feeds off of the other, what the results are, what the impacts are. The climate, biodiversity, pollution crisis, desertification crisis, they're all linked and they need to be addressed in unison. So we need member states who experience these crises and have ideas on how to address them. We need member states who punch above their weight to take leadership and to inspire us. What kinds of states are these? These are the Costa Ricas, the Fijis, the Rwandas, the Switzerlands of the world. These are states that punch above their weight. This is how we could help, how we could reimagine environmental multilateralism, both with the institutions in the UN system and with the member states that make that system. So to close, I would like to say that to reimagine environmental multilateralism, indeed to reimagine multilateralism, we need institutions who can serve as the connector of coalitions. We need institutions who can serve as the authoritative voice on the authoritative scientific voice on the environment. And we need an institution who can craft a space for influencers to consult and to collaborate. And UNEP is such an institution. The UN Environment Assembly is that space. UNEP, the UN Environment Program, is the only institution in the United Nations with the mandate to see the 3,000-piece puzzle from 30,000 feet up, and to create the space to bring the capabilities together across a wide coalition of states and institutions. I think with the next 50 years, we have to give UNEP the space to live up to its original mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Very inspiring words. Our next speaker is a climate activist and human rights defender from Brazil. Please welcome Paloma Costa. Paloma is a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate, and she currently studies social science at the University of Brasilia. In the last year, Paloma has worked to support Indigenous youth initiatives, raise awareness, and promote meaningful participation in decision-making processes. Thank you for joining us today, Paloma.
Thank you so much. It is like a big honor to be here today, celebrating this almost 50 years of the Stockholm conference. And thank you so much for inviting me and having a youth voice to refresh a little bit of our discussions. It is an honor. Well, almost 50 years after the Stockholm conference and declaration, almost 30 years after the Rio conference and declaration, we are here again in our world, preparing ourselves to, in a few days, gather again in a major environment conference, the Conference of Parties on Climate, the COP26. So, it means also 26 years, 27 indeed, we've been conversating on what to do, on acting for the environment we all inhabit. And what will be different this time? What are we really willing to do to save our existence, to guarantee the continuity of our existence here in this earth, in this planet, the only one we have? The last IPCC report says what we know for a long time, that the climate emergency we are living right now and facing is a result of our actions, of what we choose along these years, of everything the human community have been doing. We have even less time than we imagined to reach 1.5 degrees. And this is scary. This is really, really scary. And for regions like mine, which I come from South America, we are facing a real collapse coming on our ways, and it is still not seen an entire compromise for the entire world and or even of our region to do something regarding that for the world collapse. And even though with all conference declarations, agreements, we are still living in a world where our home, our Pachamama, is being destroyed. How do we think are we going to continue existing, living like this? Deforestation, which is the main cause of carbon emissions in my country, has been irresponsibly liberated. Mining in indigenous lands, trying to flexibilize environmental license, really liberating all the ways of destroying the environment. Fires, which we all seen the fires in the Amazon in 2019, where the ashes went out to São Paulo. They are still happening right now and burning all of our life just in front of our eyes. What are we going to do? The destruction, the collapse ahead of us, it is of impossible or very difficult way of recovering. And still, we are living in a world where environmentalists, indigenous people, local communities are being threatened just because they are protecting the forests, what still remains of our unities that are still conserved. We are still living in a world where indigenous people, youth, have been protecting the environment we inhabit with our lives under threat, where we don't have space, a real space to participate, where our demands, the things that we care for our present and our future, really have a chance to be listened, to be done. Well, and we still do, putting our youth, putting our lives under this threat, under this situation. We still provide this service to nature, to the entire humanity that exists in us, facing things like climate anxiety, living with fear. But we still do because we know if we are not the ones to take responsibility for it, who will take? It seems that we've been conversating about it for a long time, but not much action. Well, and although people like indigenous people have a long understand that our Mother Earth, our Pachamama, is a living being just like us, it seems the rest of human community are just realizing it now. We are now facing a collapse of our existence. The climate emergency, the COVID pandemic, the massive social biodiversity loss, they are all part of a more deeper crisis. A crisis in our structure, on what sustain our existence, our humanity, our governments, our nations, and a structural crisis. And we don't have any more time. We need to act now. This is not a joke. This is not something that we are calling on the streets, because youth, we came out from the streets to the courts to formal spaces because we can no longer live in a situation like this. None of us can live in a situation like this. We need to act. We need to reforestate our minds, our conscience. We need to re-earth our entire actions, the way we relate with each other, with our environment. It is the only way we can free our future, hold the sky that is falling upon us, and for that, we need to guarantee the minimum education. We have to guarantee possibilities for food and inclusive to all, for having clean water, clean air for all. And once I heard a great indigenous woman leader from Brazil saying something that always touched my heart, that the limits of this lands, of this earth, is in our conscience. So what are we willing to really do right now to change the paths of our existence and to guarantee the continuity of our humanity as it exists in all of us here in this world? I'm really counting with all of you participating here and listening to this amazing event to join together this fight. Otherwise, we don't have anywhere else we are going to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paloma. And you're absolutely right. Youth have the most at stake with the climate crisis, and we need urgent, ambitious, and inclusive action now. We do not have time to wait. Now, we have time for a couple of questions for our speakers. Our first question, and this is open to all of our speakers who would like to answer. Since Stockholm 50 is anticipated to be a summary of discussions, do you think this represents a perfect opportunity for discussing new ideas in the light of the need of a new declaration? Young Gustav.
Well, yes, of course. As I said, we need the conference, and we need to restate our ambitions, and we need to restate our demands. And I completely agree with what Paloma said. You know, the urgency is long past almost. And what really bothers me is how politicians dither. I mean, the fact that. Let me just give you a small story, an anecdote, which I have gleaned through diligent listening to what we could call reliable gossip about the Stockholm Conference. The Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, back in 2019, during the Secretary General opening of the UN General Assembly, invited the world to a high-level event for 3 days in Stockholm in 2022. And then the Swedish government with the Kenyan government wanted to have 2 UN resolutions to make the conference be of a political weight and value. And, you know, what everybody thought would be a smooth sailing in terms of negotiating these resolutions, one enabling and one modalities, turned out to be a very, very difficult issue. And I was curious, why is this so difficult to navigate through the bureaucracies of the delegations in New York? And what I found out, what I gleaned through rumors, and what I found out was that a number of nations did not want to have a discussion about the environment at heads of state level. And when Prime Minister Stefan Löfven invited to a high-level meeting, and a Prime Minister invites, then it is at heads of state level. And I was baffled and very much concerned by the fact that a number of nations said, we do not want environment to be discussed at heads of state level. So the 2 days we have now as an international meeting, it's not a UN meeting, it's an international meeting according to the resolution. We need to make sure that this conference carries all the weight it can. And whereas Unibet 50, which takes place in Nairobi in the beginning of March next year, is very much about the organization, we need to make sure that this conference is about the environment, about institutions like David Boyd and Maria said, and about future and hope and the togetherness that Paloma wanted to have. We need to be together on this, and we need to be forceful. So this conference is extremely important because it is also about environment and not just about the climate, just about biodiversity. It's about everything. Thank you.
Can I jump in, Kimberly?
Yes,
here?
absolutely, Maria.
I agree with Jan Gustav. It is incredibly important. It is marking a 50th anniversary of this very important conference that we teach set the stage for the global environmental governance system. However, this conference is only 2 days. And the preparatory process for these big conferences usually is 2 years. And we have not had the 2 years of preparations, or usually the 2 weeks of conferences. The Stockholm conference itself was prepared for 2 years, from 1970 to 1972, and was held for 2 weeks. And the preparations even started earlier than 1970, but Morris Strong took over and made sure that all of the world leaders were engaged. So I am a little bit concerned. We need that conference. It is a very important conference, but we have not had the kind of preparatory process that is necessary for the kind of impact that a conference like this has to produce. And Jan Gustav makes a really important point that this is an international conference, not a UN conference. And that means that we need more than the member states. So where is the action from the youth, from civil society, and I would say academia? The academic institutions as a sector have not been really engaged in the way that they could be. And that translates into the youth action, because youth grow up, right, Paloma? And they become the leaders. But I would like to see more in the preparatory process, and we have a few months leading up to the conference.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maria. Paloma?
No, I just wanted to add a little bit on what John and Maria, they just added, but I think like this is super important that we engage indeed all sectors, all actors into the discussions. I mean, it was really shocking for me when I started learning about the climate emergency, and I had just realized that I didn't had any classes, any disciplines in my university talking about it. So if we want to change things, we need to go for every spaces that we occupy, that we are part of. And not only for youth, because as you said, Maria, youth, they grow older. And I don't think we are leaders of the future. We are leaders right now. But honestly, I think this is very important. And I feel like an international conference is important in the sense where we can gather all of these actors to really pitch and discuss and agree on making a real difference. Because if we keep going on the way that we are going, we already know the results expecting us. So I think it's an amazing opportunity, but we need everyone to engage together and really go there for making a real change, investing in education, in projects where we could lead solutions in our localities. I mean, it's so hard to have your project at your university approved because there is no funding for that. So what is the compromise that we are having for the world for that? So I really believe we should go for it, but we need to have this engagement, this compromise of all sectors and member states too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paloma. Let's see. We do have another question. And this is again addressed to all of our speakers. What do you think is necessary for Stockholm 50 to be a game changer? For example, do we need new ideas or just better implementation of what already exists? Maria.
I'm going to jump in here, since this is what I work on. These are exactly the issues that I have been tackling, both as a researcher but also as a participant in several of these intergovernmental processes. There are almost two understandings and calls for action, and we see that now with COP26 coming up on climate. Let's have greater ambition, greater ambition, greater ambition. However, ambition without implementation is not sufficient. And so what we have been working on in the Center for Governance and Sustainability at UMass Boston is actually tracking the level to which countries implement the commitments that they have made on the various multilateral environmental agreements. So I would call for bringing together ambition and implementation, and committing to deliver on your commitments. And for this, we do need civil society. We do need the young people to actually hold leaders accountable. And we have to create the necessary mechanisms to do that. And I would love to hear from David how that has been done in the human rights arena. How do we hold governments and other institutions accountable to the commitments that they have made to the human rights agenda?
Well, perhaps I'll jump on that invitation and to say, just look, I think that the Stockholm 50 plus conference, that's a great opportunity to talk about these issues, but really the time for talk is over. We need action, action, action. This is absolutely what we need. And if the governments aren't willing to take action, then we have to hold their feet to the fire. We have to, first of all, we can get rid of them by voting them out at the next election. We can sue them. And this is what's happening. This is why youth are in courts around the world, because governments for too long have simply treated these commitments as optional, and they're not optional. Human rights are legally binding obligations. And so we're seeing courts around the world, in Colombia, in the Netherlands, in Germany, responding to these lawsuits by young people. And what a crazy world we live in, where young people have to sue their governments to get those governments to fulfill their legal obligations to protect the rights of youth and other people. So I'm deeply concerned. We have this COP26 coming up in Glasgow, and it's almost comical that every time there's a COP, we think this is going to be the one. This is going to be the one that transforms us somehow for the future. It's just too much rhetoric and not enough implementation. So I really agree with my colleagues that for all of the terrific interest and opportunities to have these big conferences, that's not what we need. We need action on the ground. We need to stop governments from investing in fossil fuels. How can it be that since the beginning of the pandemic, governments have invested more in fossil fuels than in clean energy? That's absolutely criminal. How can it be that we live in a world where there's such gross inequality between the wealthy citizens of the North and the denizens of the global South? We need to listen to the proposals of the small island developing states for things like an international air passenger levy, for an international shipping levy, actions that will actually raise tens of billions of dollars to help these people who are suffering today from the impacts of climate change in the Caribbean, in the South Pacific, in sub-Saharan Africa. The damage that these people are experiencing in their daily lives, when you've had a chance to talk to them, it's absolutely unconscionable that we're not taking much greater action to both address the causes of the climate emergency, but also to help people who, through no fault of their own, are suffering on the front lines of this global humanitarian crisis.
Thank you, David. And you're absolutely right. There's been a lot of great talk, but not enough action. And we need to change that moving forward. Does anybody else want to jump in? Jan Gustav?
Well, I completely agree with David, and I also hope that the environmental rights issue and the combination that you pointed to in your presentation, David, with environmental rights and human rights is understood and is even raised as a very important issue in the Stockholm conference. Lawyerly talk often, I think, intimidates or scares people. So there's a bit of information dissemination to be done there, because what you just said, it gives us the framework to act. Just a quick question also. I know a number of organizations around the world has picked up on what Olof Palme also mentioned in his introductory speech, and that was the issue of ecocide. Do you think that's an issue that could be raised, or do you think that, as some politicians have already said to me, if you raise the issue of ecocide, it will just run the entire discussion into the ditch and will get nowhere? Do you think that's true?
Well, I mean, I do think that the problem with the ecocide proposal is that in order for it to come into force and effect, governments are going to have to agree to it in an international instrument to add it to the Rome Convention that governs the International Criminal Court. And these governments, which are complicit in ecocides all around the world, are very unlikely to agree to a new process that could result in themselves being prosecuted for crimes against humanity. So as powerful as the concept is, our current system, which requires states to make themselves liable to ecocide, it seems like a very unlikely outcome. And I do think we already have the tools at our disposal. Imagine, Jan Gustav, a world in which governments actually respected people's right to live in a healthy environment. In such a world, there would be no need for a crime of ecocide, because governments would be doing the things necessary to provide clean air, safe drinking water, a stable climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, healthy and sustainably produced food. So the right to a healthy environment, which we have fought for decades for, which was really launched, and I think this is worth mentioning, that the kind of international birth of the concept of the right to a healthy environment was at Stockholm in 1972 in Article 1 of the Stockholm Declaration. It has taken us 49 years to get that right recognized at the global level, but we have done so. And now our task ahead must be to implement that fundamental right and to use it to hold states accountable for all the actions they've said they would take and have not taken. Paloma, please.
So it's very unfortunate to hear that in a bit, because hearing that, it just makes me come to a point where we definitely need to change the structures which we are in, because it's not possible that we live in a world where the work that I do with the communities, with the youth on ground, is being threatened. All of the days I am being scared or being arrested or suffering anything else from my government and others. And the governments, which have much more power than us as individuals, are not being accountable. So in this sense, what you said, it just makes me come to a point that our structures are no longer working. Just wanted to add that, sorry.
Thank you, Paloma. All right, that wraps up this session. Next up, we have a discussion panel on tools to enforce international environmental law with Ana Barrera, Director of the International Institute for Law and the Environment. And I believe we also have on that panel, Jojo Mehta from the Stop Ecocide Initiative. So for those interested in that conversation, I'm sure it will continue there. Over to you, Ana. I think we are having some technical difficulties. So I guess we'll take another moment. Okay. Actually, we have time for one final question, and this one's directed to Paloma. What do you think we need to do to reforest people's minds?
Well, first we need to give the possibility for people to have like a quality education just from the beginning of their lives, so that we can all build, since we are childs, we are babies, and a collective conscience for all. We need also to guarantee spaces for the different actors to participate. As a youth representative, I don't have any space to go to participate and really share the pen of decisions with decision makers. And finally, we need to invest in projects that happens really on ground. We need to guarantee access to information, which is not a reality for all groups of humans. And I feel in this sense, we have in like access to information and education that guarantees us the opportunity to understand this information and the spaces to civil and democratic participation. Maybe some things will change a little bit. And of course, respect the knowledge that indigenous people and communities that live so long here protecting the forest, they all have to share with us, because if there is someone who knows and listens to the forest, it is them. and they are saying that the forest, our Pachamama, is screaming, and it means really, really hard to hold up the sky falling upon us, and that we really need everyone on board together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paloma. And I think it is absolutely essential that we do this together. And I want to take an opportunity here, since we have everybody still, except David, but to answer and kind of go back and forth on what Paloma just said. We have just a couple more minutes here.
I think what Paloma said is just so important. And I really like this expression, let's reforest our minds, and let's reforest our souls as well. And as you were speaking, Paloma, it made me think we need values, and we need to be able to speak about our values, about our ethics. That's what reforestation of our inner worlds will be. Is you're talking about knowledge, but you're also talking about wisdom, and this wisdom comes from the connection with the earth, and that connection we can feel even in the cities. In this day and age, there's so many young people who are only growing up in cities and are not seeing the natural world in the same way. But there are ways that we can reconnect with nature, and I really, really like this expression. Let's reforest our minds and our souls. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I just come on and support what both Paloma and Maria said. Of course, I still remember how angry and positive at the same time we were back in 1972, and I think we did actually make a difference through our demonstrations and through the fact that we were allowed to address the plenaries for the first time at a UN conference. I just want to say one thing. Yes, I've been around for a while, and sometimes I get a bit frustrated because there seems to be a generation gap, and the fact that politicians, and I will say that in a general way, they tend to look at youth as something nice to have and something nice to listen to, and then completely ignore. And this is something we all must really fight, because being ignored is being disempowered, and you're taking away the right to act and to really be a constructive implementer. And nothing is worse than being ignored in any relationship. And so just one thing that, yes, I'm old, but I'll be around for another 20, 30 years, so count me in and count on my support.
Thank you, Jan Gustav. All right, that wraps up this session. A big thank you to all of our keynote speakers, Jan Gustav, Maria, Paloma, and David. It was wonderful having you join us today. And all right, so time for our next panel. Over to you, Anna.
Hello, thank you, Kimberly, for passing me through. Okay, so now it's time to talk about other aspects that are very important. As it has been discussed today and yesterday, we know that the United Nations Stockholm Conference not only created UNEP, but also propelled the adoption of more than 200 multilateral environmental agreements. These not only cover the protection of the ozone layer, the atmosphere, the seas, the biodiversity, the Antarctic, but also focus on fighting pollution or promoting environmental democracy, among other things. Thus, in the last 50 years, many people have been already working to protect our Earth. So it is not nothing new. It doesn't happen only after the Paris Agreement. Nevertheless, the status of the planet Earth has continued deteriorating. The 2018 United Nations Secretary General report on gaps on international environmental law and environmental related instruments already highlighted many gaps on international environmental law. Some of those relates to institutional fragmentation and that these agreements are piecemeal and reactive. in fact, the implementation of many of these international agreed commitments are deficient. The effectiveness of these commitments is essential to stop degradation and restore natural systems and resources. Tools to improve implementation and enforcement of international environmental law are essential and are urgently required. So this is the focus of this and of the next roundtable today. And to discuss about this, we count with the participation of excellent professionals and experts to discuss and to identify the tools for the effectiveness of international commitments to protect our planet. So today with me here are Jan Aguila, who is the Director General of the Global Pact Coalition. He is also professor at Sciences Po Paris and partner of the law firm Brennan Pratt in Paris, and chair of the Environmental Commission of the Club des Juristes. Hello, Jan. How are you? Okay, you are on mute.
I'm mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to pass to the next speaker too. He is Carl Burkhardt. He is the managing director of One Earth and formerly the director of Media, Science and Technology at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. Hello, Carl. Good afternoon or good morning for you, probably. How are you?
Good.
Okay, delighted to have you here. And now we also have with us today Teresa Oberhauser, who is EU project lead at Circularis and is focal point of the youth constituency of UNEP. Hello, Teresa. Welcome to this panel.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Jojo Mita, who is the co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide International and chair of the charitable Stop Ecocide Foundation. So probably you all know today what is the Ecocide initiative. So I don't need to explain it, and she will speak about it. So Jojo, hello, how are you? Are you with us today?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Hello.
Hello, nice to see you again. Okay, so I would like to have with you a dialogue. I don't know if any of you have any PowerPoint presentation. If you have, please let me know. But if not, it will be better to have a dynamic dialogue among the four of us. And I'm going to pose you questions regarding the topic of this panel. In particular, I'm going to start with Jan. And I would like to stress on the need for a global framework for the environment. So my first question for you, Jan, today is, what do you think, why the implementation, or what has failed in the implementation and enforcement of environmental law for you?
Oh, what a huge question. You can hear me. That's okay. I'm not on mute. You can hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. So, first of all, thank you to this invitation. I'm very pleased to be on this panel. On this issue, I invite you to have a look on our article with Marie-Cécile de Bellis. We wrote an article, and the title is A Martian at the United Nations. It's naive talks on global environmental governance. And you can find it online, and you will see, we imagine it's a kind of parable. And we imagine a Martian, a kind of little prince who would come to Earth. He liked very much Earth because it's a beautiful planet. And he would see how the little human beings who have destroyed their planet are going to solve these problems. And we imagine some answers to this problem. So I'm going to be short now. And we can say that there are many failures of international environmental law. Of course, there are success also, but at the end of the day, 50 years after the first Stockholm conference, we can say that history of international environmental law is a history of failures. Failures first in the elaboration of treaties, because the decision-making process is not effective, and failures in the application, the implementation of treaties. Because in the field of international law, justice is an option. Just a few words on each of this issue. First, regarding the elaboration of international law. Unfortunately, the decision-making process is often paralyzed. Why? Because you can see all the example, the Copenhagen Conference, the project of International Organization for the Environment, etc. Why? Because negotiators are facing a dilemma. They have to make a choice between two goals, either an ambitious agreement, but they would not have all the countries on board, or a universal agreement, but not ambitious. And at the end of the day, we can see that many agreements are not ambitious or not binding. We have many soft law declaration, and at the end of the day, after 50 years of international environmental law, we can see the result. There is a destruction of our planet, a decline of biodiversity, an increasing of the emission of CO2. So first, a failure in elaboration. Second point, failure of implementation in environmental law. And the issue here is that there is no sanction. As a jurist, as a lawyer, I think that we need sanction. We need to go to the justice. If you and me sign a contract, if you do not apply the contract, I can go to the judge. But if states sign a treaty, never mind, there is no sanction. Justice is only an option. Of course, we have compliance committees. There are no international environmental court. We have committees, but these committees have no power. They are not judicial bodies. They are only administrative bodies. They can now take a decision of sanction, and they can now be referred to by NGOs, only by states. So at the end, we can say that we have to change many things. I think we have to change the matrix of the governance, of the global governance. I don't want to be too long, but just, and I can go back on this idea after, but I think that we have to build a new global environmental governance on a new concept. The new concept is the idea that we have a global interest. It's a global public interest. We can also call it the common concern of humanity. If we share this idea, the implications of this idea are very important. That means that the interests of each state are inferior to the global public interest. And that means that it's one of the implications, but that means that in the decision-making process, we have to find a way to make a decisions with only the majority of states, but not the unanimity of states. Because if they are, like I said, paralysis of the decision-making process, it's because we are always trying to have the agreement of all the states, including the United States, including the Russia, this is the cause of the paralysis of our decision-making process. So I think it will be difficult, but there are solutions to build a new global international governance.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer, which is really very interesting, but it's a big challenge because, as you know, the system we have today is built after the Second World War, and how the governance system of the United Nations works, and even starting with the Security Council. And in 2012, at IDMA, because I didn't introduce myself, I work at the International Institute for Law and Environment. We proposed for Rio Plus 20 to impel the creation of a compliance committee at all multilateral environmental agreements. As you said, are administrative mechanisms, but there are many MES, so multilateral environmental agreements, that they even don't have this kind of mechanism. So the governance, definitely, you have pointed the main problem, but it's a big challenge to change because of how it's working today, the United Nations system. So this is something that we have to work on all together, and we cannot delay that. So, okay, and now I would like to pass my question to Carl, because for international environmental law, science is very important. The science policy interface is essential because the adoption of many multilateral environmental agreements was thanks to science. And some paradigmatic examples are the ozone layer. After the findings of Nobel Prizes, or the legal regime of the CBD, of biodiversity protection, or even the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that was thanks to the first IPCC report. So how can science contribute these days to improve the implementation and enforcement of international environmental law? And also, could you, if you can, offer us or some ideas on tools that could help us to improve the implementation of international environmental law, given these failures in governance that Jan has just mentioned? You're on mute.
There we go. Thank you for the question and this great opportunity. It's such an exciting discussion. This discussion is needed to happen, as pointed out in the last session, probably 2 years ago. But we're on it now, and next year could be a key moment, as the past couple of months have had really some turning points in the MEAs, the multilateral environmental agreements. So just quick point on the Montreal Protocol and Ozone, because I feel like that was the gold standard of science powerfully being presented, governments quickly aligning, and a convention with teeth and legally mandated reductions was implemented. Of course, we've always tried to replicate that with Kyoto Protocol, with climate, and that failed, of course, after Copenhagen. And now we're in a world which is very much based on the concept of NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. So we've agreed that we're going to have lots of discussions and get our understanding better, but then all the countries are going to go back, talk to their people, and they're going to then come back and see how it all adds up, right? So it's a very inefficient process of how science then informs the policy. But so before I dive into the problems, I do want to acknowledge that Assessment Report 6, which came out last, end of August, which is the first working group. So that's on the our global understanding of the physics of climate science. I believe it is perhaps one of the greatest accomplishments of humanity, that assessment report. If you look at, it's the sixth report. The first one was in 1990, and you look at what's happened in 30 years in terms of the acceleration of our knowledge of how the climate system works. That is something to acknowledge and admire. So I wanted to say that, but of course, you know, there are risks with this approach. So at least in the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, the IPCC has a very formal input. So it's mandated to have these assessment reports. We actually lack that in the other two major Rio conventions, which we'll get to in a second. But I guess the main point was, despite this, we have this issue where, you know, despite increasing clarity on the science, and literally we have, you know, fires raging all over the United States, and West Virginia is a state that's particularly been hit by flooding. We have one senator in the United States who has decided that he's going to, you know, completely undermine the climate agenda for the United States. And of course, the United States, along with China and India and a couple others, are the key actors in the COP coming up in a couple of weeks. So we have this incredible risk where one individual with one special interest, and that senator makes $500,000 a year on his interest in coal. So we have this like problem of this approach where we have NDCs, and then it comes back, and one single individual in one country in one jurisdiction can shut everything down. So this is at the highest level, our meta problem. And so science, I do want to talk about science because I do think it's really important, but I also want to say that I think we need a step change in the role of science in dictating the common agenda. Right now, it's very much like advisory, and it has to move if we are going to survive as a society. It's going to be very tough above 1.5 degrees Celsius in global average temperature rise. If we're going to survive, we need to have science have a more direct role. And that's something at One Earth we work on a lot, is we fund critical science gaps to inform decision-making, particularly around the multilaterals, but also at national and subnational levels as well. So I just wanted to say quickly, we have this important concept that came about through the IPCC, the UNFCCC framework on common but differentiated responsibility. But you know, we have the problem in there. It's an important concept, but the problem is, of course, like I said, one government's plan to decarbonize could actually harm another government. So, for instance, we saw today, I don't know if you guys saw the story, but a big story broke this morning that several governments were working very hard to change the scientific outcomes of Working Group 1, which came out in late August. And they were very actively lobbying to remove language that clarified the need to end fossil fuels. And so, you know, we have this problem where, you know, the do no harm principle isn't really in place in the conventions. And just quickly to move to biodiversity, which is an area that I think One Earth and my work is probably most known for, co-authored several papers with a bunch of scientists on this. We have the problem in the CBD, or the Convention on Biodiversity, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So that got kicked off at Kunming with the Kunming Declaration just a few days ago. And the negotiations will be happening next year. Under this agreement, it's actually it's a lot more complicated because it's multiple conventions nested under one, the post-2020 framework. And there are some big missing ideas. Like, for example, science has now gotten a lot clearer than when the convention started. And we can all agree that every government owns its land. So let's talk about land for a minute. Every government owns its land. But who owns the ecosystem? This is the question that hasn't yet been addressed and brought forward strongly in the convention. Ecosystems don't care about country boundaries. Sometimes they correlate, but usually they cross over boundaries. And you know, we're clear that a government should be able to do whatever it wants to with its land. But if a government does something with its land that harms another government, is that allowed? And we don't have agreement on this. So, forests, for example, we can say that Brazil owns its forest, but we now know with a lot of fidelity, actually, and this year, past couple of years have been big breakout in science on this subject. We can actually determine where the global carbon sink is. So the global carbon sink, in our analysis, it's holding about 2 trillion tons of carbon. It's on approximately 50% of the world's remaining land. And it is keeping our climate system in balance right now. It absorbs about a quarter of our emissions every year. So if someone harms the carbon sink by doing an action on their land, there's no consequence right now for that. So to the former speaker's idea on the, what are the, what are the restrictions that the governments can put on each other for this type of activity? So that's not clear. And the other issue we have with the Convention on Biodiversity, sorry, I'm getting over a cold. The other issue there is that, unlike the UNFCCC, IPBES, which is the kind of equivalent to the IPCC, the science body, doesn't have a formal input role. So it's even weaker than the UN, the Climate Convention. We could talk about CCD, the Desertification Convention, later, but so there's this big question out there. Like, another example is whales. Who owns the whales? It turns out whales are a huge part of the global carbon cycle. And if someone kills a whale, there's no repercussions for this, and it harms the global climate system. So these are some of the issues we try to tackle with some of the research. The paper we're best known for, I think, is the Global Safety Net and the Global Deal for Nature, which are advancing a notion of common but differentiated for the Convention on Biodiversity. And we in this paper, we analyzed a lot of science, compiled it, and it came out with this finding that there's roughly 30% of the world's land is very important for biodiversity, and another 20 is very important for carbon storage beyond that, so 50 altogether. This is widely cited now in the High Ambition Coalition of countries, which is now 68 countries, and the United States. But still, again, science can come in and help bring clarity, because that's now I just wrote a piece last week, this is being misinterpreted by a lot of the national actors as a sort of catch-all target, because people like to simplify things down, and actually science needs to bring a lot more nuance into that. So just to end, I think what's clear is that the three big conventions have been very good at getting the discussion to happen and getting global agreement and having the global conversations. But as the previous speaker said, they're not good on implementation. And the proposal to have compliance committees is like, that's the beginning. Like we don't have this really built into the operations of the Rio conventions. So, I think probably what's needed is an infrastructure that sits above the three conventions and the other multilateral agreements that they can dock into, that starts to build in compliance around some of these issues like governance, common heritage, global commons. I think I would argue a little bit on the idea of a common concern, because I think that is being advanced by some, but I feel like we actually need to go beyond that and really talk about common heritage and common ownership, because you can't, concern is a little bit too loose. I believe in legally getting actors to comply with the statements they're making and pledges they're making under the conventions. We need a higher level of a legal concept around the commons and who owns it. It's collectively owned. It's very difficult to attribute a portion of the commons to a country. It probably can be done with science. I'm not saying it can't be, but I think we need to move. We need that step change where science is really starting to drive implementation, rather than just sort of be an advisory to a separate set of decisions being made under the conventions. So I'll just end with that. There's a lot more to say. This is exciting.
Okay, yes, it is exciting. It is really very very interesting because, as you mentioned, I mean, the role of science at the national and subnational levels is fundamental. And as you know, there are many countries, starting with the UK, that established their own expert committee on climate change, the scientific committee, and many countries has followed suit, as France. Now in Spain, we are going to create one, and this is really key. And what you were mentioning on fundamental principles of international environmental law, I would say it happens the same as I told to Jan on that we are still living in a world that it is based on the decisions taken after the Second World War, because as you mentioned, the CBD is built on the principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which is something that was developed as part of the new international economic order, as part of the post-colonialism. So this is a challenge nowadays, and also about damage. Even though we have principle 21 of the Stockholm Declaration and principle 2 of the Rio Declaration that puts limits on the use of the sovereignty, not to cause damage to other states or areas beyond national jurisdiction. But politicians, they believe that the concept of national sovereignty is a very absolute concept, but it has its limits. And it started with the Trail Smelter arbitration case. So this is fascinating. I'm really enjoying this, listening to you, because we have a lot to talk about, but now it's the time for Teresa Oberhauser. So Teresa, you belong to young generations, and we need to protect human rights for future generations too. So after decades of efforts, a safe and healthy environment right has been recognized at the international level. So although many constitutions already recognize it, it is this human right, it is still not respected. And this is evidenced by the current status of our Earth system, and as it is indicated in the Planetary Boundaries Framework. So do you think that the international recognition of the human right to a healthy environment will make a difference and will contribute to improve the status of the Earth system and therefore the protection of future generations? And what do you propose for implementing and enforcing this right effectively? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, and it's a pleasure to be here. And to answer your first question, if it is an important, basically an important step that it has been recognized, to be honest, yes and no. I mean, generally speaking, of course, it is a great step. It is a very groundbreaking step, an important stepstone. But it alone will not do enough, and we will need far-reaching further legislation on all levels that concretizes that. If I can go a bit more into detail on the youth side, as a coordinator of the Children and Youth Major Group of UNAP, we see that there's huge progress when it comes to the attention for young people, when it comes to their integration in processes, in decision-making situations as well. But we still see that there is basically, it is still based on invitations. Young people are invited. It is not based on mandates. So we're still in a situation where, in that case, if we're debating such rights, such for a safe environment, or specifically for young people and future generations, at this stage, one of the most important things we need is a mandated space for young people at the table to discuss those things, where they do not have to be scared that if they say something wrong or they are not pleasing to the negotiation, they're not invited again, but where they're included by mandate. And in general, we also see that there is still, in general, a big lack of awareness for the need of a safe and healthy environment. Being at the age where some friends are already looking into the fact of, having children, building up families, and so on, I see that even in my generation, there's a lack of awareness about our political and business decisions that impact the well-being of the immediate next generations. And this is one very important understanding that we have to create, I think, specifically as civil society stakeholders, that there is a clear connection, that we're not talking about 100 years ahead. We're talking about immediate effects on our day-to-day life and the days of our direct next generations. we have extreme weather events, we have economic and health impacts like COVID, we have migration that will result from environmental destruction globally. And those things are already happening today, and many parts of the world don't have structural releases and insurance systems to actually tackle those kind of things. So this is actually very closely linked to the human right for a safe and healthy environment, that this is a joint global activity that needs global solutions, and that we will not be able to tackle on a step-by-step basis and on a situation. I see a lot of European people in this event here today, and a lot of representatives of the global north of the world. And we have in many parts of the global north such assurance systems which do not exist in other parts of the world as such. So we have heavy impacts that we have to prepare for. So it is very important to see how can those costs in our society be distributed. How can we make sure that this kind of right for a basically healthy environment can actually also result in assurances for such global rights on the system. Generally speaking, we need more youth engagement in those processes on a basically mandated basis. And we also have to understand that incremental change is not going to fix this. We are past that moment where incremental change can still fix the situation. As a youth representative, I'm coordinating the working group of the Children and Youth Major Group on Resolution 7333, which is one of the negotiations happening in the UNEP process. And we see that also the ministerial declaration there that we are handling at the upcoming UNEA is really at a very basic level and is not far-reaching enough. We are in a deadlock where we can decide between binding agreements that lack concretization or non-binding agreements that are concrete but are not actually implemented by the majority of countries. So we need more of that compliance, and we also need more support system to support those countries that are not able to implement it by themselves. Generally speaking, also looking at the research and development work in the European Union that I'm working on, we also need a lot more speed. We need a lot more research funded and activities there in order to implement the activities at a much more short notice. Stockholm+51 and UNEP at 51 being in the upcoming year, many people talk about the upcoming 50 years. We're not talking about the upcoming 50 years. We need to make a change in the upcoming 5. As you've heard in my introduction, youth participation is still voluntary-based. Next to my voluntary work, as you've mentioned in the introduction, I work for a small startup for supply chain transparency and traceability in leading research and development on how can we actually make supply chains more sustainable? How can we implement circular economy? How can we actually implement such rights for healthy environments, also from a business perspective? In research and development in projects in there. And I realize that we often forget the role of businesses in making this change. And we're not talking here about this kind of, good and bad kind of thing. What kind of role do businesses play? But just very generally speaking, environmental law and a safe environment and its lack is closely linked to the operations of big businesses globally. So it's very important that those are held accountable and that we make systems that hold them accountable. We're talking about environmental law here. And one of the most important points for this human right on a healthy environment is to make sure that it is actually complied with, not just on the national and government basis, but actually on the company level, that multinationals that are operating globally are held accountable by the human right on a healthy environment. And for that, we need more transparency. No matter who we hold accountable, the big businesses creating destruction or the consumption of us, the consumption patterns of the things we do in high-income countries, the story is always the same. More compliance and more accountability starts with more knowledge and transparency. We don't actually know what we're consuming. We don't actually know what we are doing. We go to the supermarket thinking we're buying something good, but we don't know, is it actually good or is it greenwashing? Citizens and civil society need more information about the practices of governments and specifically of companies. Why did politicians decide for policy X or Y is something that we in civil society have been working with for a long time already to create more sustainable, more transparency there. But we also have to learn what does it mean for the environmental destruction if I consume Y, and what are actually the practices of big multinationals for the product that I'm holding in my hand. We need clear and binding regulations for economy and multinationals. We see often that specifically by governments that there's this rhetoric of we cannot have far-reaching environmental protection policies. We cannot have far-reaching adjustments to our economic system. Yes, we can. Companies have researched for 10, if not 20 years, what they have to do to adjust to circular economy, local sourcing, products with longer lifetime, rare earth recycling, and rare earth extraction with a less environmental impact. They are prepared for that. We do not need to babysit multinationals. Sustainability of businesses has to be clearly falsifiable. At this stage, there's, in my country where I'm living, so many packagings and products in the supermarkets that say recyclable, recycle, 20% recycled content. We don't even know, not even as consumers, we are able to actually understand what is actually happening out there, what is not. And that is, first of all, not encouraging businesses to become greener because no one actually knows who is green. And secondly, it also is not very far-reaching for basically protecting the right for a healthy environment. We need specifications of the human right. We need rules for the economy so that everyone can actually play by the same rules and we can have far-reaching requirements. So to finalize, the human right to a healthy environment can be an amazing stepstone for reaching concretized and actual legislation that regulates business operation in a synchronized way globally, because it is globally. It is an important stepstone for new understanding of the lack of lobby for future generations, because I am half young. There are people that are a lot younger, and there are many, many people that are not even born and do not have any lobby whatsoever in our political systems. It is also a stepstone for the need to involve youth, as they are immediately aware of the effects of the decisions on their own lifetime when they're talking about environmental issues. And it is important that is a reminder of the costs of inaction and the fact that the time for incremental changes has passed. To get back to the first statement that our keynote speaker, Jan Gustav Strandaris, has said, where he was referring to a statement made in Stockholm in 1972, that this statement is still relevant today, as he said. Let me put it a lot clearly. If he says the statement is still relevant today, it means that we have failed to address it on time. We have very little time left to address it now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. I would like to recall that because you have emphasized on the role of multinationals and businesses for ensuring this new human rights at the international level, that the next panel will be a representative of businesses. So maybe you would like to state and to pose directly to him some questions, Teresa. But I think that nowadays there is a big movement and it's happening at the EU level, particularly, which is the sustainable finance movement. There are now, the European Commission has proposed, and some of the rules have been already entering into force, about how to make the financial sector sustainable. But I would say that it's all about, a lot of these new rules is about transparency, but it has so many standards, so many metrics. There are some of the rules that are more than 500 pages. So we have to take care, because what it's important, transparency is key, but it's also absolutely important that these businesses, they have clear policies to make a change, and that we can and there are institutions to follow up their implementation of those policies, and that they are really well implemented, because otherwise we will be lost in translation. So now I'm sure that Jojo has been enjoying the last comments, because she will have many things to say about, in line with, because of the ecocide. So I'm going to pass you now the questions. And ecocide, as you know, and you have impelled this, we come now with a definition, a legal definition that has been elaborated by a distinguished panel of legal experts. So from my point of view, this is the first step to a process to include finally this new crime of international law in the statute of the International Criminal Court, and also, which is very important, in the national legal frameworks. So how could ecocide help to improve the implementation and enforcement of environmental law at all levels, international, national, regional? And what governance mechanisms do you propose to avoid ecocide?
Thank you so much. And this has been an amazing panel to be listening to, as well as the last speakers I heard from the previous panel. I was thinking every single conversation, I've been like, okay, when do I get to speak now? Because I think, it's absolutely right that there's some really global systemic changes that need to happen, and they need to happen fast. And what's actually needed is some kind of strategic intervention that can actually start pivoting things into that direction that we all know we need to go in, that everybody's moving very slowly in, the ones that are moving in that direction. As one of the speakers just highlighted, there are in the business world, there's the potential to move in completely new directions. There's the knowledge, there's the historic research, scientific, governmental, it's all there, all the information's there. We're just not moving that way quick enough by a very big factor. And what we would say to that, in terms of supporting the implementation of the body of environmental law, which is obviously relatively young, in a way you could say it started in 1972 at Stockholm, it involves, we think, a strategic intervention that could do this is actually criminalizing ecocide. And that is because it's a structural intervention. It's a simple one. It's very precise. To do it is the procedures, the steps are all set out, and in the context of the International Criminal Court, it's actually achievable because it's a one state, one vote system, and it requires a 2/3 majority to actually adopt a change to the statute. Now, what that means is that you don't have to have the biggest, dirtiest players to do it. That's one thing. But secondly, it's the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems of all its member states. So it's not like a human rights court. It's not a separate environmental court, of which there is not yet one, although I suspect there will be in the future. It's actually a complementary court. So all the member states, any member state ratifying a crime there will also have to include it in their own domestic legislation. So it's actually a very efficient and effective way to get a serious new ground rule that operates across jurisdictions in a coherent way. And of course, with transnational corporations, that's very important because they have this potential ability to sort of hop jurisdictions according to where regulations are more lax, for example. So that's very important. And I think I was actually rather saddened at the end of the last panel by David Boyd, who's just done this incredible work, bringing to fruition the recognition of the right to a clean and healthy environment, actually saying, oh gosh, well, maybe if we mention ecocide, we're going to lose everybody and nobody's actually going to move in that direction. I would say that's absolutely incorrect. And I say that in a joyful way. It is incorrect. And I know this because this is what we're working on, and we know how many governments are actually talking about this and taking it seriously. Already there are 16 member states of the ICC who have a public conversation around ecocide recorded either at parliamentary and or at government level. And I mean, very briefly, I can just read you that list alphabetically. And some of them may surprise you, but Bangladesh, Brazil, Bolivia, Belgium, Canada, Chile, Finland, France, Luxembourg, the Maldives, Mexico, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, the UK, and Vanuatu. So, and there are a half a dozen more behind the scenes who've been speaking with us or our associates, but haven't yet spoken publicly about this. So this is not a pie in the sky idea. It's actually a very real conversation that is in very real progress. And what we would also say, which is one of the beauties of this particular initiative, and has become in a way more beautiful because of the panel of experts who brought out a legal definition a few months ago, is that this is not a 500-page treaty. This is a one-sentence definition. And it's a one-sentence definition that I will read out because it is only one sentence. Ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And there is a further paragraph that elaborates the terms, what those terms mean, but the whole thing fits on less than a page. The beauty of criminal law is that it is relatively simple in comparison with environmental regulation. But I think the thing to point out here, the thing that makes it so incredibly helpful in supporting all of this environmental body of law that has evolved and actually enforcing it and actually having governments and businesses take it seriously, is that criminal law operates in a different way to civil law. This is not about how many toxins can you use in this particular context before you cross a certain line. This is more like, if you like, it's. I mean, firstly, it's an enforceable parameter, and it can, obviously fit in with the existing criminal justice system. So it doesn't actually require a new governance mechanism. It actually would fit into the governance mechanisms that are already there. But effectively, what it has the potential to do is to create a kind of foundation that is currently missing. Now, if you're working on human rights or social justice, what you have is a very sort of internalized knowledge, which is obviously reflected in the legal system, that murder, mass murder, torture, crimes against, all of these things are not only criminal, but they're deeply bad and morally wrong. If you're operating in the environmental arena, you simply don't have that. There is no foundational piece that creates that taboo. And that is what ecocide law can do. So, even though, of course, I mean, it's aiming at the international level, one of the reasons to do that, although the definition won't catch every environmental crime, what we know is that there are environmental crimes and regulations in place that should be catching those lesser ones. But the fact that there is no sort of profound bottom line rule means that those are not being taken seriously enough. So you put it at the highest international level. What you're saying is not just this is criminal, this is unlawful. You're saying it's bad and wrong. And what that does is actually profoundly significant. It's missing currently, and it's profoundly significant, because nobody will go to a government and say, can I have a permit to kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? I mean, it's literally, maybe it crosses your mind if you're criminally insane, but nobody's going to apply to a government on that basis. Of course not. It's absolutely beyond the pale. There's a profound taboo there. We don't have that same recoil from destroying the environment. And that comes back to something that's actually sort of underlying at a far deeper level, all of this, which is that we have a mindset problem. We have a really deep mindset problem, of which our current system is the logical extrapolation. No single person is at fault for the system we currently have in place. It goes back hundreds of years, with the division between spirit and body and the whole Catholic Church, in the division between, reason and nature, intellect and emotion, all of those things. That dualism just runs right through Western thought. And we've ended up with our colonial system, as a natural result of that, the domination, the seeing of nature as a resource, all of that. As soon as you put damage to nature at the highest level on an equivalence, on a par with damage to humans, you start to shift that. Maybe in a small way, but you start to shift that. It's quite profound, actually. That then, if it starts to acknowledge actually what is a profound reality, which is that we are deeply, deeply interconnected with the environmental systems around us, with the ecosystems around us, and actually that kind of goes even sort of beneath the kind of who owns what. I mean, ultimately, if we mess this up enough, the planet's going to shake us off and recover itself over however many hundreds of thousands of years, but we won't be here to see it. We don't own the planet. I mean, what kind of planet are we on if we think we own the planet? There's a really fundamental issue here. But just putting that precise single extra crime in there could actually create a small, simple, but really pivotal point that could make that difference. And it protects that right to a clean and healthy environment. Just as the fact that it's a crime to kill you, in other words, murder is a crime, is what protects your right to life. So it's all very well and absolutely right for David Boyd, for example, to be saying we need to actually have governments act according to these obligations and these rights. But the fact is, if you don't have the restrictions in place, the boundaries, the parameters, which we do with criminal law, that's what our system does. We use criminal law to create those moral parameters. If that isn't there, then how are you going to get that to move? You're doing what was it Einstein said, where you're trying to, was it the definition of madness, where you carry on trying to do the same thing and get a different result? Maybe it wasn't him, but anyway, effectively, you change the rules of the game, even by a small amount, but a significant strategic one, then you've got a chance of creating different results. So yeah, a bit of a long answer. I know we've probably all overgone our time, but yeah. That's
yes. Thank you, Jojo. No, you were on time. Otherwise, I would have let you know. Okay, yes, I think one of the points of which is very interesting from the definition of ecocide is that it refers to unlawful. So we can make use of any international, any multilateral environmental agreement to put it into play. And it recalls me very much how it is defined under our system in Spain, in our criminal code, how it is defined environmental crime, which relates to you need to breach an administrative environmental law. So this is very, very in the same way. And I think it will help very much also to enforce international environmental law. Any unlawful act, we have many definitions in more than the 250 multilateral environmental agreements. So thank you very much, Jojo. I don't know if we have, it seems we don't have any specific questions from the audience. So I've been reacting to your interventions, but I would like to give you the opportunity to the four of you. I mean, we don't have much time, so with that restriction, we have 15 minutes. If there is no questions, if you want to interact with your colleagues, because I'm the one that is directing this roundtable, but you also can, if you have any specific question to any of your colleagues in this panel, or you want to interact, that will be great. I don't want to be the only one that has that chance. So Jan, do you have any question for your colleagues? You are on mute.
That's okay. Okay. Not a question, but observation, reaction. Now, I just wanted to interact with Jojo about the diagnosis. I think that it's true, and many jurists have this same diagnosis, that there is a lack. We have no cornerstone in international environmental law. We have many sectorial technical conventions, but we need a cornerstone. And ecocide could be, I agree, a kind of cornerstone, but ecocide is a criminal approach. It could be useful, but we have, and I realize that I now mentioned our main proposal. We have another proposal, a complementary proposal. It's the Global Pact for the Environment. And as I think you know, we propose this text, this founding text, and it would have exactly this role, this role of cornerstone. And the negotiation between states are very difficult, but we have a resolution of the General Assembly of the UN entitled toward a global pact for the environment. It's 2 words, and the way is long, but maybe one day we will achieve this goal. What is the idea? The idea is that in many fields of law and in many society, we have a founding text. We need a founding text, very simple text, not technical. This kind of text, you know, that you can put it on the wall in the classroom, and with all the values. This kind, for example, we can imagine that ecocide would be a part of the Global Pact for the Environment. I mean, with all the main values that a society share, because we need to come back to the value. And Anna, and it's true, you say that we are now under the framework of 1945 and the charter, but remember, what are the first words of the UN Charter?
We the people.
We the peoples.
Yeah.
You know, this breath, this spirit, I think we forgot it. We forget that we need value. And I see that the international environmental law nowadays is only a law of technicians. It's very sectoral. It's about pollution. It's about waste. It's about, okay, it's important, but we have to come back. And it is the beginning to the value. Why? Because it is like in a couple, to conclude, like in a couple. You know, in a couple, sometimes you have difficulties. We know that. And when we have difficulties, like between states, we need to come back to remember why we go together. What are our shared values? And that's why we proposed a global pact for the environment. And I hope that one day we will have this kind of founding text like the Magna Carta, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We need that in the field of environment. It's my conviction.
Yes, definitely, Jan. But we also need to change many principles that we have now, as the principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources. So there are many challenges. So we need to build principles and to reform some of the principles that are blocking the environmental or the planet protection agenda. And this is really very difficult because as negotiations goes, and you explained it very well on the need of consensus, unity, and all these matters. But we have now a question from the public, and I would like to pose it to you. Any one of you can answer it. If the question is, if harming human is on the same level as harming nature, where does the animal life fit in this? Should not harming animals be at the same level? Does anyone would like to answer this question? Jojo or Cara? Because Cara, you are talking. I mean, I didn't realize because you were on mute.
Oh, sorry. No, I was going to say, I think Jojo should answer this one, but I do think we have to talk about how we're defining animal. I hate to be scientific about it, but there's domesticated animals versus wild animals performing very different things. But let's take it over to Jojo.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that was one of the one of the points I was going to make. But also, I mean, in relation to ecocide, for example, when you go into what the sort of definition of severe damage might be, it does actually include damage to, for example, an entire species or an entire ecosystem, which could include a whole number of species. So it does very much come into that scope. And of course, there are whole other discourses here around how humans treat animals as opposed to how animals treat other animals, and how the natural system works. And what it often comes down to is the way in which, actually, again, it comes down to that same kind of mindset of humans treating everything else on the planet as something that is for their particular use and enjoyment, or use as a resource, rather than part of a system that functions as a whole. And it's very difficult to make absolutely across the board decisions in terms of exactly how animals are treated in different places, because things are very, very different across the world and in different countries around how farming is treated locally in different places and so on. But what we can almost always point to is that industrialized monocultural agricultural practices are very, very problematic in most cases. So I think that's something that is fairly safe to say. I think one of the other things that's possibly worth thinking about here is we're very aware, and a couple of the speakers have highlighted, particularly Teresa, about how urgent the situation is that we find ourselves. And at the same time, I have to point out, with the exception of the particular crime of ecocide idea, we're also looking at very, very big solutions, and you have to have a bridging point to those solutions, but one also has to see them coming. Because and I think this speaks to what Jan was talking about in terms of the difference between criminal and which is often seen as this is a punishment, whereas looking at the values is actually going back to what we share. But actually, in our dominant system, we do use criminal law to draw the ethical lines. That is actually where we show our morals and our ethics, is by where we draw the red line and where we say, no, this is not okay anymore. And at the same time, and that doesn't have to be a negative thing. We think, on the contrary, criminal law is ultimately protective law. Your right to life is protected by the crime of murder. Your right to a clean and healthy environment will be protected by a crime of ecocide. But the important thing is that unless you can see that coming and clearly see it coming, you can't make those adjustments. So it's also really important, this is another reason that we aim for the international level, is that when governments and the corporate sector can actually see a new, a change of rule approaching, They can use it creatively, and I think that's where the way that businesses are already equipped to do things. I mean, we've seen it over the last year and a half over the pandemic. We've seen that governments can act fast. We've seen that businesses can act fast. So all they need to know is, I mean, imagine how constructive it could be if we actually tapped into all that knowledge. I mean, we spoke to the brother of my co-director who works in big infrastructure projects, and he came up with half a dozen very specific questions as soon as he heard about ecocide law. And we sat there going, oh my God, this is amazing. This is exactly what should be happening right across society. We should actually be saying to people, I mean, hey, the youth movement, Fridays for Future. I mean, imagine if we responded to that genuinely and said, okay, let's use our Fridays for the future. What if every single Friday afternoon in every sector, every workplace, every legal chambers, every government department, everybody stopped whatever else they were doing and went, right, how are we going to address this global crisis? And how are we going to do things with a new ground rule in place that says you mustn't destroy the environment? Now that would actually be a constructive use of a few hours of everybody's time to address a complete existential crisis. So I think we don't have to see these things as negative. They can also be seen as the liberating parameter that actually enables us to get creative. Because as a former entrepreneur myself, I know there's nothing better than a strict limit to get really creative.
Okay, thank you, Jojo. Now we have another question, but the question on animals is very interesting one, because I think we have to make differences about wild animals, domestic animals. In Spain, we are discussing now a law to protect animals, and it's been the scientific community has come in to the public scene and said, okay, we have to have care, because, for example, with cats, I mean, cats has been endangering lynx in the Iberian lynx here, because there are many people providing food to cats in the streets, and they know how to get food, and so there are still many things. That's why I agree with Carl that we have to define what its animals are. I mean, it's really very important at this point. But I want to pass to the next question. Jan already mentioned something on that, and it's could not the Global Pact for the Environment integrate law of ecocide and rights of nature? Those are some of the best and most important initiatives for nature protections we have today. So even, of course, Jan, you have the floor, but if any one of you want also to answer, and I just recalled, we have 5 more minutes to end. So yes, so short answer, please.
Okay, very, very short. Just to say, in a word, the idea of the Global Pact for the Environment is that we need a kind of ecological constitution, global constitution for the ecology. So after that, this is the idea, this is the role in a legal system. After that, the content of the Global Pact could be very open. And I don't know, why not the right of nature? This is another issue. It is an issue of discussion, of consultation with all the NGOs, and all the citizens. But the idea is that we need this kind of ecological constitution. And why not with this idea of the new right, the right of nature?
Thank you for your short answer, Jan. I want to give the floor to Carl, that he has a question for Teresa. Please, Carl.
Yeah, it's so great to be on the panel with Teresa, because we're very interested in leadership from this new generation, and they're cutting through all of the white noise and clutter of those of us who've been like at this for decades and know all the minutiae and the mechanics and the gears. I feel like we're all working at sort of like inside the machine, trying to switch knobs and levers, and the global youth are thinking at this higher level, and people like Jan and Jojo, of course, too. And but I guess my question is, there's sort of this, I kind of think it's like a banquet of sort of new ideas on the table. Rights of nature, ecocide, we've got this idea of sanctions. I'm very interested in the idea of sort of incentive, like, can we rethink the Bretton Woods system to reward countries that have a lot of rainforest and are not getting compensated for that right now? For sure, this is not going to happen through the private markets. Like, anyone who says it is delusional. Like, the level of money needed to protect the nature that's left is a lot greater than probably can come through private markets. So I'm just curious, being in the youth leadership seat, you guys are probably looking at these different ideas, and from your perspective, like, what gives you the most hope or clarity about like where you think global governance needs to go in the next 5 years? Because like you said, it's our 1.5C window really at this point is 5 to 10 years if we do everything right. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Al. I tried to answer it in the 1.5 minutes I have left. First of all, thank you. I think one of the most important things are literally the topic of this discussion here, to make sure how can we, stop talking but get this into legal documents. I'm not a lawyer myself, so for me this is also interesting to really basically see how the ecocide discussion feed in with the pact discussion, which we are following very closely. In the UNEP negotiation space, indeed, the pact is a very big point right now, but also illegal regulations around marine litter and microplastics, but also mining, and of course chemicals and waste that we're following very closely. And there, of course, the resolution 7333 is something we're looking for very specifically Stockholm+50 as well, because it's this link. On the one hand, a lot of civil society movements towards making it an environmental law conference. On the other hand, a lot of pressure, specifically from the UN side and the Swedish side, to make it a very sustainable consumption production focused work. And I think we have to bring them both together. One of the most interesting things that is being discussed in the EU space is, of course, the idea of basically making a nature value, as you've just mentioned, financially viable. I mean, there are now a lot of, actually in the UN system, even a lot of initiatives to actually calculate the environmental value of countries, just like we calculate GDP and so on and so forth. That's a very important aspect. And secondly, the unanswered question of how can we create very far-reaching binding agreements while at the same time having them in an ambitious way with compliance generating facts. So also the question of how can we create a more basically this kind of joint feeling that we have in new movements like youth movements right now, where it's but much more of this kind of global feeling of we're in this together, we have to figure it out together. Global North has to support Global South and vice versa, because there's a lot of indigenous knowledge we can learn from as well in the North. So how can we translate to the business system, and how can we translate to basically supporting systems? I mean, UNFCCC is a very good example with a lot of initiatives already around the NDCs and so on to supporting countries. And I think this is something specifically in the UNEP space that we need to advance way further with, to really have a lot more of this monitoring and supporting systems for like a day-to-day check and visibility for people as well, and specifically young people, on where are we actually at? What are actually the problems? Because right now, many of the things that go wrong are actually covered up very well. And that's something we have to basically find ways to stop. And of course, also the interlinkages there between businesses and governments, where we've heard it earlier about the working group of IPCC, where there's a lot of this kind of influence happening behind the scenes, which is not understandable looking at our current environmental situation, and has no place there.
Okay, thank you very much, Teresa, and all the panelists. I have enjoyed a lot moderating you. I would like to recall now that the audience and everyone that has participated in this conference can contribute to the draft declaration by clicking the pop-up link in the left-hand side and accessing to the Google form, the declaration for the common future. And I just want to share with you, just to end, that as you said, Carl and Teresa, we need in the next 5 years to save the earth. And I want to share, I keep this from my times of a student when I was studying my LLM environmental law in London. That was the Rio conference, coming together to save the earth. And I always see just behind me in my desk, and still we haven't achieved it. So I just share this, and I hope, as Jan said, we together maybe can save the earth. Okay, we must try it. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you having a coffee very soon in real life. Okay, not in a screen. Bye-bye, and thank you very much to all the audience. Bye. And you have now 10 minutes to stretch your legs. Thank you.